You're listening to Parasearch Radio, news, views and reviews from the world of the paranormal from across the UK and beyond. Find us on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web. Parasearch UK Radio. Parasearch Radio, broadcasting to the UK and beyond.
The views and opinions expressed by presenters and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Parasearch Radio or its affiliates and sponsors. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Haunted Histories with your host Penny G. Morgan, right here on Parasearch Radio.
Good evening. Welcome to the last Haunted Histories episode of 2017 with, as ever, yours truly, Penny G. Morgan. Yep, that's me at the helm, guiding you through all things historical and haunting. It's been a genuinely fascinating year for me and quite a sharp learning curve since I started this show in April. And I do want to genuinely thank every single one of you who has supported this show by either being one of my absolutely brilliant guests or being one of my absolutely fantastic listeners. Thank you. Without you, it would have just been me talking to myself, which of course is something I do quite frequently, but it's nice to know occasionally other people are listening. We will be back on January the 3rd with a Haunted Histories Revisited special, where myself, Kerry Greenaway and Kaz Rooney will be discussing some of our favourite episodes of 2017. So do tune in to hear our thoughts. Well, tonight though, we're going to be visiting one of my favourite cities in the whole world, the beautiful York, up in the northeast of the UK. And we're going to be chatting very shortly with the superb Mr. Simon Entwistle, storyteller extraordinaire. You probably remember Simon from our Pendle Witch episode. So, as you're most likely fed up with my voice already, I'm going to forego our normal little history lesson before we talk to my guest and bring Mr. Entwistle straight in. Hi Simon, how are you?
Hello there, Penny. Fine, thank you. Nice to talk to you again.
And you. Well, thank you for joining us again. Obviously, it was over in the summer that we had our last chat and you told those amazing tales about the Pendle Witches and what happened with them. And I still have people talking about that episode and when are you going to be coming back on to talk about something else. So as we both talked about how much we loved York when we were off air after the Pendle Witch thing, I thought York would be a good one for you to come and tell us some of your experiences and some of your tales, as you do conduct tours around York, I believe.
Yes. Like you, Penny, I actually fell in love with the city when I first saw it. It was a real shock, if you will. Way back in 1975, I joined the army.
Right.
I don't know why I joined the army, but I did do. And
you thought you looked good in khaki, is that what it was, Simon?
Well, I think I'd watched the film Zulu or something, and found myself as Michael Caine, really. But I did join the army, and I arrived at the railway station on this beautiful June day in 1975. And even getting off from the platform at York, I thought, what a gorgeous station this is.
Yeah.
What a beautiful building. It just struck me as a teenage boy. I then made my way outside and climbed into the back of an army truck that took me to the barracks in York. To get there, we had to go for the city itself.
Yeah.
And as I looked out the tailgate of this truck, I saw the Minster. I saw Lendal Bridge. I saw the fantastic entrance to Stonegate. And I thought, what have I done? I need to be looking at this right now. But it was whilst I was in the army and based at York that I took a real keen interest that is still with me to this very day, Penny, really.
Yeah. It is one of those cities that it latches onto you, doesn't it? I don't know anyone who hasn't fallen in love with it when they've been there.
Exactly. I mean, I can guarantee, as we talk now, the city will be full of Americans, Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, people from the EEC countries.
Yeah.
It's a tourism gem, an
Yeah.
absolute tourism gem.
Yeah. I mean, I've got friends who went to university there and they still enjoy going back, just to walk around. And one of them, she did her history degree at York University. And I was thinking, what a better place to do a history degree, somewhere like York.
Right, you are.
Yeah, it sort of would really, really fit. So, I mean, you're saying you fell in love with it as a sort of 19-year-old, was it you said, when you were 19 when you joined up?
That's right.
Mine
This
was
beautiful, beautiful summer's day, Penny,
Yeah.
and the gorgeous sunshine, beautiful warm sunshine. And as the truck went over Lendal Bridge, I gazed out the back of the tailgate of the truck and saw these beautiful pleasure cruisers going up and down the River Ouse, and I thought, what a place! It was like going to a different world, really.
Yes, because so much of the history is still there as well. So many of the old buildings, the old streets.
What is so unique, of course, Penny, is there was just one raid in World War II, just one raid, which fortunately hit the Mansion House. One bomb hit the Mansion House, but that was the only thing that was damaged.
Yeah.
The Minster was left, and these were reprisal raids for the Royal Air Force attacking German cities. But just the one raid, and luckily, only one building was damaged.
Yeah.
The rest of the city was spared, and that's really a godsend, because when you look at tourism, it is the third most visited place in Great Britain.
Is it really?
Outside London and Edinburgh. London, Edinburgh, York, they're the three big ones.
I can see the similarity between Edinburgh and York, though. Some of the buildings and the sort of vibe of the place.
The vibe is the same, yes.
It is, isn't it? It is.
The same vibe.
Yeah. But yeah, I fell in love with York as a teenager. I'm not sure whether I was 13 or 14, on a school history trip, like residential history trip, and it was a few years after the Jorvik Centre had opened, at the time the Jorvik Centre was like this major thing of technology, wasn't it, when it first opened, and the fact they had all the smells, and I believe they'd use a perfumery to create the authentic smells of toilets and animals and everything else, as you were on these little cars that at the time when you're young you thought were really fast, and then you go in them as an adult and you're sort of like, I can walk faster than this. But it was one of those places that so I'd gone just after that had opened, and I remember my friend Paula and I sort of wandering off to explore and do our project or whatever it was, all the different things we had to find, and just being absolutely blown away by the city and what it had, and the walls and the gates and all those different things. And 30 years on, I'm still in love with the place, and I still get a big smile on my face when I get to go and visit it.
Of course, Penny. Same here.
Yeah. So York has got it's got a lot of history. Way back. In fact, don't they believe that it was actually a sacred burial site at one point? And it's also meant to be one of the most haunted cities in Europe, according to the statistics.
I think mainly, Penny, because every single street comes from a different era and a different time.
Yeah.
And I think it's magnificent when they have a dig in York, because they always come up with something exciting, really.
They do, don't they?
And one of the most recent finds was at the York City Museum grounds.
Oh, right.
And the museum used to be, of course, the old prison.
Yeah.
And BT were putting in a fibre optics cable towards the museum, and they dug a trench, and they found the foot of a very, very long skeleton. Right. They removed a lot more soil, and they found 15 very, very tall skeletons, well above average.
Right.
And skeletons were removed, and they were taken to the university and carefully inspected. And enamel was from teeth, and they found that all these skeletons, these huge guys, came from North Africa.
Right.
They also found on their backs the scapula, the clavicle, the fib and tib, some unusual marks, very unusual marks, and they couldn't work out what they were until one bright chap from the universe said, "I've got it." And he got a lion's tooth and placed the lion's tooth perfectly into one of these marks that was made in the scapula of one of these poor lads. And they were literally thrown to the lions for entertainment purposes. And, of course, they'd have to fight for their very, very lives.
Yeah.
They were gladiators.
I was
And the
going to say,
Gladiator
did they
Museum,
carbon date them? Because that does sound like Roman
they
sort of
did.
influence, doesn't it?
It was indeed the
Yeah,
Roman influence. Of course, Rome, one of the largest garrisons in England at that period of time,
yeah.
was at Eboracum, and there'd be a huge garrison base there. And of course, these troops needed to be entertained, and the Romans needed to be entertained, and they would literally throw these poor guys to the mercy of these lions. But I'm sure one or two of them may have put up quite a good fight as well, actually. But the Gladiator Museum is open. It's right next to Jorvik.
Right.
And as you walk in there, you see these huge skeletons.
Yeah.
They were massive, these guys, absolutely massive.
That must be a new museum then, because I don't remember that
It
last time.
is the latest one. It's the latest one. It caused such an amazing stir when they found the skeletons because,
Yeah.
York keeps unearthing its history, really, Penny, and
Yeah.
that's the most recent one. And they've put the Gladiator Museum right next to Jorvik, so it's just a quick trip round the corner from Coppergate, and you're there, of course.
Yeah. Well, as you mentioned, the museum is where these things were found. We'll talk about the Castle Museum first off, if that's okay, Simon.
Sure.
Obviously, the museum itself, it's housed in what would have been probably 18th century, 1700s prison buildings.
Yes.
But before that, there was a castle there that dates all the way back to William the Conqueror, I believe.
That's
Isn't it,
right.
the actual castle,
Right.
so sort of 1067, 1068. And has been somewhere that people have been incarcerated and tried and everything else for over 1,000 years now. What sort of famous inmates, because there are some, were held at
Very
York?
much so. Well, by far the two most famous ones were Ned King and Richard Palmer. Richard Palmer, commonly known as Dick Turpin. Now, King and Palmer, they both came from Colchester, Essex.
I'll say that
And both
Turpin
men-
definitely is an Essex boy. Yeah.
Oh, they were part of what's called the Essex Gang. And of course, these lads got heavily involved in highway robbery.
Yes.
There was a huge wager on the Essex Gang's heads.
Right.
And so Palmer and King thought they'd go up north.
Yeah.
And they made their way up to the city of York. And at one time, of course, York was really the capital of the north of England.
Yep.
And there they made their way to a public house called the Blue Boar. And
Right.
the landlord was a chap called Jonathan Briscoe. They got on very, very well with Briscoe. And it wasn't long before both King and Turpin had converted Briscoe into highway robbery. And when the coaches would arrive at the Blue Boar, that's when both men would have a good look and see how much jewellery the ladies had, how much money the gentlemen had. And then they'd make their way just outside York to a place called Haxby,
Right.
the crossroads at Haxby. And they'd hide behind the hedgerow and shout those famous words, "Stand and deliver." Between them, from 1734 to 1739, they made a small fortune. But
Yeah.
all good things come to an end when the redcoats were dispatched to the city and indeed to Haxby. And the lieutenant in charge of the platoon thought, right, gentlemen, I shall take off my red tunic, put a black cloak on. I want 12 marksmen inside the coach. We shall make our way to Haxby, and we shall capture these brigands. Well, they set off in a beautiful October's afternoon in 1739 and made their way to the Haxby crossroads. Waiting behind the hedgerow was indeed King and Turpin, and they shouted those famous words, "Stand and deliver!" As words deliver left their mouth, they heard the words "fire," and the army volley fired from the side of the coach. And Ned King received 2 musket balls in the chest and fell to the floor as dead as a doornail. Whereas Turpin managed to get back on his horse and gallop back to the Blue Boar and shout to the landlord, "I've got the army, they're right behind me." The redcoats surrounded the Blue Boar, and both Briscoe and Turpin made their way up to the hayrick, which overlooked the main bar, and they held off the redcoats for 3 long hours, killing 3 of them. They fired the last round. Turpin said to Briscoe, "You make a run for it." And he climbed out of the back window, down the drain pipe, but the army saw him. They volley fired and killed Briscoe on the spot. Turpin was now out of ammunition. The army barged into the Blue Boar, rushed upstairs, grabbed him, and took him to the jail. He was then thrown inside the jail itself, and of course the whole country was fascinated by Dick Turpin. And they decided to make his execution almost like a ceremony at the racecourse, Tyburn, at the racecourse. But Turpin, to the very, very, very end, was going to defy the laws of the country. He was led to the gallows. A rope was placed around his neck, and this huge audience, including the mayor and other dignitaries, came to watch the execution. As Turpin is climbing up the ladder, halfway up the ladder with a rope around his neck, he jumped off, therefore actually stopping the ceremony from really taking place, because he took his own life before he got to the top of the gallows. His body was cut down, and strange enough, it was taken back to the Blue Boar, placed in a coffin, and people could pay as much as 2 pence to actually look at the body before it was interned just behind the Blue Boar Inn. However, Penny, at night time, when it's really, really quiet, down towards the York City Museum in the dead of night, the sound of a galloping horse has been heard, almost like a... Who else could it be but Dick Turpin, alias Richard Palmer?
On Black Bess.
That's the one. That's the one.
Wow. So
his grave is a huge tourist attraction, of course, and he's one of York's most famous sons, of course.
He is, yes, and I think I upset someone once when I said he's actually from Essex.
He is. No, he's an Essex boy.
He is an Essex boy. He used to camp out in Epping Forest a lot when.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Very much.
Yeah.
Yes.
But I upset someone in York when they said he was from York, and I said he's not actually. He's from Essex. He went up to York, so maybe I'm following in Dick Turpin's footsteps if I ever move up to York. Who knows? Who knows? So, were there any other hauntings associated with the Blue Boar then? Because obviously that must have had quite a. If the landlord there was allowing people like Turpin, who he knew who he was.
It's a gorgeous, gorgeous pub. I mean, these pubs in New York absolutely reek of history, and the Blue Boar does have another ghost story, but a more recent one from 1907, where the landlord was a chap called John Mercer.
Right.
And John married his wife Edith at the age of 47. They were both 47. Quite unusual to wait for that age, actually, to get married, but they did do. And they actually got married in York Minster, 1907. And the last thing Edith expected was to conceive, but she did do.
Wow.
She gave birth to a perfectly healthy baby boy. As you can imagine, this little boy was loved beyond all words can comprehend, really. He was showered in love and affection. But just before his 5th birthday, he contracted what's called scarlet fever.
Oh, no.
And in those days, of course, it was a death sentence, and the poor lad died of scarlet fever, breaking his mum and dad's hearts. We now pick up the story 25 years later, when the local window cleaner, a chap called John Gorham, arrived at the Blue Boar. He got his ladder at the side of the building and started to clean the windows. In the corner of the room, he saw a little boy, waving and smiling. He waved back, the little boy waved back at him, and every 14 days, John Gorham would arrive to clean the windows again. He saw the boy on a regular basis, and after 15 months of doing the job, he thought, that's strange. This boy is not getting any bigger, and what's more, he's always wearing the same clothes. He cleaned the windows of the next door home, owned by a lady called Mrs. Jackson, and he told Mrs. Jackson, and she said, oh, no, Mr. Gorham, no, you're seeing things. The Mercers did have a little boy, but he died a good 25 years ago, a good quarter of a century ago. Gorham then plucked the courage and had a word with Mrs. Mercer. Mrs. Mercer, I've no wish, no intention to upset you, and please forgive me if I do. But I feel it's my duty to inform that every time I clean the windows, there's always a little boy upstairs. He always waves and smiles at me. A huge smile came across Mrs. Mercer's face. Oh, don't worry, Mr. Gorham, don't worry. It's my little boy. He's never left me, you know.
Oh.
That is a very, very true story.
Oh, that's actually bringing a tear to my eye. Oh, how... Oh.
It's a very touching story, isn't it, really?
Isn't it? Oh, that's lovely. Okay. Oh, I'm lost for words now. Thanks, Simon.
It's a very touching story, that one, I must...
It is. As a mother myself, that has actually... yeah. But back to the museum at York,
yes.
where good old Dick Turpin, fellow Essex lad, fellow Essex bod like myself, was housed before his execution at, I presume, York Racecourse we're talking about.
That's
That he
right,
was
that's
taken
right.
to.
But to this very day, Penny, you can go, of course, into the museum.
Yeah.
And there, as you walk into what's called the condemned cell where Richard Palmer spent his last meal, along with other sad cases, a hologram of the actor Bob Hoskins will arrive from nowhere. And it's almost by modern technology. He just arrives, this hologram arrives in the cell. And, of course, Hoskins, who was a great British actor, plays the part of Richard Palmer with that gorgeous Essex twang as well, if you will. And he tells a whole story of how he got there, and he knew he was going to lose his life, but he thought, I shall defy this lot right to the very end. I will not give them the opportunity of watching me squirm. Yeah. And he didn't either.
Mm. But he's not the only sort of ghost associated with the museum, is he?
No, it's a very, very, very haunted building, of course. And the staff at night time tell me when they turn the lights off, the last person to leave leaves very, very quickly. Because you have got a street which used to be in the old exercise yard. And to this very, very day, you can see the names of prisoners who've scratched their names on the exercise wall, who've been deported to Tasmania. Yeah. There are 5 names which have always fascinated me: Ratcliffe Ingham, John Walmsley, William Rawlinson, John Proctor, and Robert Hartley. And these 5 men, of course, York was industrial, and it did have textile mills that led straight from York into Bradford, to Saltaire Bradford, right into Harrogate, and right, of course, to Skipton. And these 5 lads, they worked at what's called the Rogerton Brearley Mill in York. It was a textile mill in 1842. And at that period of time, all the mills were having brand new steam-driven equipment installed. And there was a recession in world cotton and wool for that period of time. And these men were just eating potatoes. That's all they could afford. Yeah. And the 5 of them went to a public house, which is now long since gone, terrible shame, called the Unicorn, which was actually heading towards Fulford Road, which is the inner roundabout at York to this very day. And they sat around a table and they said, right, lads, we need to do something. We need to actually twist the arms of the York textile barons and get decent wages and decent conditions. How can we do that? Well, what we need to do is to pull the plugs out of all the new boilers, these new steam engines that have been installed in our textile factories, get everyone out on strike, and then we can demand better pay and better conditions by getting everyone out on strike. They had no idea, but someone had been listening with great interest, who slowly tiptoed out of the inn, the Unicorn, and ran down Stonegate and straight to the police commissioner's home, Police Inspector Commissioner Shepherd. Shepherd was told about the rioting that was going to take place at 4:30 the following morning, the 15th of August, 1842. And he therefore went to see the local magistrate, Mr. John Hindle, and John Hindle galloped at great speed to the barracks at Fulford. There, in the barracks was a brigade of the Black Watch, the Highland Scottish Infantry. Mm-hmm. And at exactly 2:30 on the 18th of August, 1842, our boys got into action. They broke into Rogerton Brearley's, they pulled the plugs out of the boiler, they extinguished the flames, and all the textile workers came out and applauded them. They then marched towards the city centre, going to the Dandy factory, pulling the plugs out of the Dandy factory, and that stopped production. By now, you have 5,000 textile workers walking straight towards the shambles and straight towards the city centre. At the bottom of the shambles, a place called Whitmer Watbergate, was a thin red line of Highland infantry, Scottish soldiers armed with muskets and bayonets. In front of them was Mr. Hindle, the local magistrate, and he shouted at the top of his voice, "Our sovereign lady the Queen chargeth and commandeth that persons assembled are to disperse peaceably with their habitats and lawful businesses. Fail it to comply with this order, resulting in tumultuous and righteous behaviour, we would have accordingly, God save the Queen." As the words Queen left his mouth, the infantry opened fire on unarmed textile workers. 14 people fell to the floor, as dead as doornails. The infantry then knelt down to reload. Ratcliffe Ingham, one of our 5 brave lads, rushed forward. He jumped up and grabbed Hindle, the magistrate, from his horse and gave him a good hiding on the side of the pathway before 4 Highland soldiers knocked him unconscious. Robert Hartley disarmed a Scottish soldier, took the musket off him, turned the bayonet round, pointed towards the Scottish soldier, and shouted, "You fire that musket, and I'll run you through. You take my life, lad, I'll take yours too. A fair day's work for a fair day's pay," before he too was knocked unconscious. At the end of that terrible day, at the bottom of the shambles, in 1842, some 28 people lay dead. The blood flowed down the gutters, right down the whole length of the shambles.
Wow.
Our 5 local lads were arrested. They were brought in front of the York City magistrates, and there they were sent to death by hanging. They showed no emotion whatsoever. In fact, Ingham was heard to say the words, "I've got a wife and 5 children waiting for me, sir. I need to be back with my kids, sir. You should have thought about that before you took up arms against the Queen's soldiers." However, the death sentence was commuted, and all 5 of them were then sent to the jail in York, where they scratched their names on the exercise yard, and the following day they were deported to Tasmania. When they got to Tasmania, they would probably weigh about 5 or 6 stone, and all 5 of them were worked to death in Tasmania. They never saw the beautiful city of York ever again. However, the damage that had been caused that day had to be paid for. So therefore, all the textile works of the city of York were fined, and they had to not only pay for the damage that had been caused that day, but also for production losses. It seems the textile workers of Yorkshire never, ever had it easy. However, way back in the year 1902, a delegation from Boston, Massachusetts arrived in the city, and they knew something which the Yorkshire textile barons didn't. They knew that the tackler was the best textile worker in the world. When I say tackler, that's exactly what the tackler did. He looked after the looms. A loom is a weaving machine.
Yeah.
And these guys knew how to repair them, how to work them, and a good tackler could keep 6 of them going at the same time. The Americans knew this, and they arrived in the city of York and Bradford and Leeds and Lancashire as well. And they said, "We can offer you 5 times as much as you're earning here in York. We'll even pay for your passage across the Atlantic. We'll give you a 40-hour guaranteed week with every Saturday and Sunday off."
Wow.
And if you do go to Boston, Massachusetts, and pick up a phone book, every second name is a Yorkshire or a Lancastrian one.
Really?
Because these tacklers made their way across the ocean, and they showed the Americans how to weave properly.
Never knew that. When these men who started this uprising, when did you say that happened?
It was 1842.
1842.
August 1842. At that period of time, all the factories in Yorkshire and Lancashire are having brand new steam-driven equipment installed. Steam engines to keep the looms going.
Yeah.
It was modern. It was very, very modern, ahead of the rest of the world, really.
Yeah.
Before that, you have what's called hand loom weavers.
Yeah.
And of course, these guys and girls, they would literally use their feet to get the loom to work properly. But with steam-driven equipment being installed, it was state of the art.
Yeah.
In fact, Yorkshire and Lancashire were the world leaders in textiles, Penny.
They were, yeah. Having grown up visiting my grandmother lived in Yorkshire, in Lancashire, I was very used to seeing all the mills. In fact, where she was from in Lee in Lancashire, I think there was 11 mills at one point in that one town.
Sure, they were there.
I do remember when I think there's still 2 buildings left. I think one of them they are trying to open as a museum, but it's not safe. Where I think there's possibly an asbestos problem in one of the bits they've got to sort out, because it's got one of the most innovative, one of those steam engine driven systems in it. But I do know when the building that was closest to where she lived, and I know we're talking the other side of the Pennines right now, but I do remember her telling me stories about relatives of hers when she was little who used to work at the mill, and she'd sometimes go in to take them their lunch, and how noisy it was. And I was quite sad when they pulled that building down. I remember them pulling it down when I was a teenager, and I was quite sad because it was the town to me. Does that make sense? It was
very much
Lee.
so.
It was what I associated with Lee. So
It sounds like that. Textiles. Well, in Lancashire, it was always cotton.
Yes.
It was always cotton in Lancashire. Cotton likes a damp environment, apparently.
Yeah.
Whereas in Yorkshire, cotton and wool.
Yeah.
Cotton and wool. And you look at the Yorkshire Dales and all those thousands of Swaledales and Herdwicks, good quality cotton in Yorkshire, of course. But they never had it easy. Never had it easy. The textile workers never.
No, it was hard. I do remember my grandmother telling me stories about. I'm sure it was her uncle who worked in it. I'm sure it was her uncle because I think her dad was a local butcher, so it must have been her uncle who worked in the mill. And I do remember her telling me how hard he worked, and it's fascinating. Wow, I never knew that about the shambles. That's fascinating. So, the exercise yard in the castle museum. Sorry, that's where that old Edwardian type street, Victorian street's been built, isn't it?
Very much so. But if you do look at the walls, you'll see a lot of graffiti, and of course the graffiti it's beautiful, really, because it's real history.
Yeah.
And whenever I go to York, I do look at those names, and they're very brave names, really, extremely brave names. And even in the Minster, when I go in the Minster, I go behind the choir area and just put my hand behind a little recess and rub my finger over the word 1758. One of the stonemasons left his name there. A chap called William Kane, 1758. And I just think of that day when he did that, when he left his name. And let's
hold that thought. Let's hold that thought. We're going to take a quick 20-second break now. But when we come back, we'll start talking about York Minster, if that's okay with you.
Very good, Penny.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bear with us. We're just going to take a quick 20-second break, and then Simon and myself will be back.
Hello. Harry Price here. Good evening. If there's nothing myself and everybody else enjoy here on the other side more is the sit back and relax and listen to Parasearch Radio with its paranormal news, views and reviews from across the UK and beyond. Make sure to find out more about them on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web, whatever they are, to keep up to date with all their broadcasts throughout the week. And I hope you enjoy them as much as we do over here. Hello? Is anybody there?
Right, and we're back. Now, we're if you've only just tuned in, we're joined by the brilliant storyteller and guide, Mr. Simon Entwistle, winner of tourism awards. Many tourism awards. You feature quite a lot on Radio Lancashire and all those kind of things, don't you, Simon? Talking about all the various places that you do tours about.
That's right.
But we're talking about the other side of the Pennines. We're not talking about Lancashire. We're talking about the White Rose side of York in North Yorkshire. And we've chatted about my fellow Essex person, Dick Turpin, because he was held at the York Castle Prison, and his body was left at the Blue Ball pub. We've talked about the museum itself and the tragic treatment of the textile workers who in 1842 decided to complain against the conditions that they were being expected to work in. And one of the things we were just talking about is the fact that if you go into the York Museum, there's a Victorian Edwardian type street, and on the walls there is the old exercise yard, and you can actually see the graffiti that was left by these gentlemen when they were being held there in the 1840s before they were sent to Tasmania. And we were talking about graffiti, and one of the things that Simon just mentioned was there's a date that's carved into the wall at York Minster. I think you said 1758?
1758, that's right,
Yeah.
Penny. Whenever I go into the Minster, I look for little nooks and crannies. And behind what's called the choir stalls, you get various pillars. And this name, it's a chap called William Kane, 1758. He was a stonemason.
Mm-hmm.
And I always rub my fingers over the date and the name as well. And I just think of that day when he actually put his name there, 1758. Such a long, long time ago. And I often thought what it must have been like when he left the Minster that day and walked for the city, just how much it would have changed, and would he have appreciated 21st century York. But as I said before, Penny, what is so gorgeous about the city is that every building, it's almost like a time warp. And we're so lucky to be alive today to look at this and take it all in, really. And I feel sorry for those people that can't take it in because, you can go to any cafe, any pub in York and just sit down by yourself.
Yep.
And you can daydream to a different era and a different time. It's just fantastic, really.
Yep. No, I feel sorry for people who can't do that. Who can't imagine, who can't, like you say, see what it was. But York Minster itself is quite an interesting place. I mean, obviously, as a building, it's sort of 1,400 years old anyway, from when it started being a religious icon building. I'm not sure how to describe it.
Yes,
but
yes,
that's got, in my opinion, that's got some of the most interesting paranormal stories that I've ever heard. And we were talking about someone, a fellow tourist colleague, I suppose. He does the Haunted York tours.
Oh, yes.
We were talking about his name. Sorry, his name's just escaped me. You mentioned that he's been doing it for over 20 years.
Tony Mercer.
Tony Mercer, that's right.
He is a local lad. Now,
Yeah.
Tony is York born and bred, and I find by far the best tour guides are people that live in their cities.
And love their
There's
city.
a smashing chap called John Aitken from City of Oxford, and he's a local lad, and his tours in Oxford are just outstanding. But Tony Mercer's very, very similar. He lives and breathes, and you can meet Tony at the Exhibition Square in the City of York, most nights actually, and he will then take you into Petergate, into Stonegate, into Fossgate, into Swinegate, and round the back of the Minster, and taking down to the bottom of the Shambles.
Yeah.
And to the Merchants' Hall. But what he doesn't know about the city is no one's business. And the very first thing I did with him, we went outside the Minster, and he mentioned that way back in 1967, the Minster was in danger of literally collapsing.
Really?
And someone had noticed that the foundations were slowly giving way. They could feel it. It was sinking like a millimetre every single day. Now, of course, the Minster is a national treasure. So the British government said, look, we'll throw as much money as you need at it.
Yeah.
And they brought in some very, very highly professional people to look at to save the Minster. And of all the people to arrive were some Swedish engineers.
Right.
And they thought, right, the Minster is definitely sinking into sludge. So we need to get the sludge out of there, and we need to get some concrete beneath it to support the weight of the Minster. They sent 3 frogmen down some specially bored holes by the side of the Minster, and they went into some very, very deep water. They took with them torches, and the 3 of them went into another world. They started to swim down a Roman road.
Wow.
They shone their torches on the wall. They saw alabaster plaster. They saw neat rows of walls, culverts. And when they got to the surface, they couldn't stop talking. They said, no, you've got to save this. You've got to save what's down there. Because York Minster was practically built on the garrison headquarters of the Roman garrison of over 2,000 years ago.
Wow.
And the builders had used the foundations of the garrison itself to build the Minster on. So these Swedish engineers worked out a plan. First of all, they had to get all the water out. They then had to work out how to get these huge concrete pillars beneath the Minster itself to save it. But they thought at the same time, we need to preserve the Roman underworld under there.
Sure.
And that's exactly what they've done, Penny.
Really?
So you can walk into the Minster itself, and you can go down to what's called the crypt. Then you go down this beautiful twisting staircase, and you enter the Roman road down there. And you look at the walls with the original Roman plaster. You look at the culverts, and it looks as if someone's just built it. They're over 2,000 years old. You look at the sewage system, the heating systems.
Really?
Absolutely amazing. But the Swedish engineers, they knew exactly what they were doing, and they preserved the Minster for hopefully another 2,000 years.
Oh, I hope so. I'm hopefully going up to North Yorkshire on my summer holidays this year, so I'm
Yes.
making lots of mental plans of things now that have changed in the sort of, when was I last there? 4 years ago. So I've got a lot of things to visit in York.
Yes,
That's
yeah. But
changed.
it's
But
also, sorry, Penny, I beg your pardon.
that's all right. That's all right. Well, what I was going to say is one of my, it's not one of my favourite stories, I was told. But if you ever hear a dog barking
Oh
in
gosh.
York Minster, you know the story I'm alluding to?
Oh gosh, yes, yes.
Seamus.
Yes, yes, yeah. What is quite beautiful, really, of course, when the Minster was being built, the lads who started never ever saw the end product.
Yes.
Took quite a few years to build and quite a few centuries, really. But there's a place called the Chapter House. And as you go into the Chapter House, in beautiful carvings, beautiful stone carvings right around the Chapter House, you see lots of faces. And what these faces are is they are beautifully recreated by stonemasons of their friends.
Right.
Beautifully created, and they look just like you and I. The only difference is that they came from totally different centuries. They look absolutely amazing. However, one story is about one of the Minster stonemasons, a chap of the name of Philip Wiles, and Wiles had a dog called Seamus. Loved the dog very, very much indeed.
Mm-hmm.
And Seamus would go with him everywhere. Now, of course, even in medieval times, they had scaffolding. And it's said that Seamus would actually bound up under the scaffolding, and there he would sit next to his master whilst he was hammering away at the stonework all day long. Of course, the height of the Minster was quite high, and poor Seamus sadly fell to his death. But to this very, very day, he's still there. And just behind the Minster, you have what's called St Michael's College. And St Michael's College, of course, has a curator to this very, very day. And way back in 1964, a new curator was given the job, and he came from Nottingham. And he arrived with his wife and family from Nottingham in the Pickford's vehicle, and they unloaded all the tea chests, all the furniture from their Nottingham home to be installed at St Michael's College at the curator's home. The last job they needed to do, really, because it was quite a long journey, was to put up all the curtains. And he got his children to sleep very, very quickly. And he climbed into bed himself with his wife, and bright, bright moonlight was emanating through the window. It was almost like daylight, really. He turned over and heard the sound of tiny footsteps, and the door slowly opened, and in came a liver and white spaniel. He thought, oh, no, I must have left the door open downstairs. He got out of bed and advanced towards the dog to grab the collar, to take it down the stairs, to place it outside on the streets of York. As he approached the dog, his hand went straight through it. He made a second attempt. His hand went through the dog. He sat on the end of the bed in a state of shock, as you would do, really. The dog turned, as if its name was being called, and looked towards the window. His wife, who had been in a very, very deep sleep, woke up with a jolt, and to see her husband sitting at the end of the bed. "What's wrong?" she said. "Oh, I've just seen this dog. My hand's gotten through it. I tried twice. My hand went right through it." "Oh, that's amazing," she said. "I've just had this dream. It was as clear as daylight. There's a man outside the house, pointing up at our bedroom window, wearing Victorian clothing and holding a dog lead." A most amazing story. They believe the dog was indeed Seamus, who is still there to this very day.
Oh, I know. Oh, yeah. No, it's still around. Still around. One of the other stories I quite like that I heard about the Minster was of I don't know if you've heard this one, but it was in the I think it was in the 1800s, and apparently a group of friends were visiting the Minster, and one of them they got separated, and they were approached by an officer in a full naval uniform.
Oh yes,
you know this one, and he apparently whispered in the ear in the one of the ladies, and then just disappeared.
Yes.
And it transpires he was the brother of the woman he'd spoken to, and he had literally just been killed.
Yes.
At sea, but they'd made a pact that whoever went first would come back and confirm to the other one that there is
life after death.
Life after death, and supposedly what he whispered to her, there is a future state, and then went away. I quite like that story.
It's a beautiful story, isn't it? Really?
It is,
That is a beautiful story. And of course, what a great location to hear it as well, of
Well,
course.
exactly.
Yeah.
But that's one of my favourite ones. But one of the other dog ones I'd heard was about the dog that was bricked up because it had annoyed the other stonemasons. And that was another story I'd heard about the Minster. I'm sure there's a lot of legends surrounding the Minster and these kind of things.
I'm sure. I do know there were 2 fires there. One was done deliberately by a chap called John Martin.
Right.
And luckily, he was classed as insane, so they couldn't actually arrest him, really. But in '84, there was a most amazing story of the Archbishop of York, who actually questioned the fact that was Mary, Mother of Christ, was she actually a virgin? He actually questioned it.
Really?
And the following day, this lightning bolt hit York Minster.
You're kidding?
And of course, the fire started. And by some amazing twist of fate, an American tourist who couldn't sleep was walking past the Minster when he heard the flash and looked up and saw the rose window on fire. He took a photograph, and he had no idea that photograph was going to earn him a fortune. Yeah. It shows the rose window with flames licking out of the rose window and lead melting down the side of the Minster.
Wow.
What was amazing about that night is the fire crews were so quick, they saved the Minster from imminent damage, really.
I do remember the Blue Peter appeal when they were designing the new roses for the
bosses.
Yeah. I do remember that because I was about 10 or 11, I think, when it all happened. I do remember, and I remember seeing the news footage of the Minster burning, and when I went to visit it a few years later, it was kind of hard to put 2 and 2 together and realise that was what we'd seen on the news. But it is a beautiful. It's got
amazing.
It's got a lot of stories to tell. It has got a lot of stories to tell. But let's go.
You could sit in there, couldn't you? Really, just take it all in.
I do. I have done. I even just sitting outside, just watching it. I've done both. I am that person that people tell their children to steer clear of because they're not sure what they're doing. But onto a slightly less nice area, and I don't know how to pronounce Bedden.
Yes.
And for anyone who doesn't know, this part of York was actually where all the slums and the down at heel people
it was very
were
much
during the 1800s.
York. Very much out past York. Yeah.
And one of the interesting ones is that there was a ragged school come orphanage that was in that area, and the parish beadle who operated it. Do you know this story at all, Simon? George Pym. Yeah,
that's right. Mr. Pym was rather a nasty character. Actually.
He was, wasn't he? Yeah.
And of course, he looked after the town's orphans. But when they died, he would actually put them under the floorboards and still keep the money that was given from the city council. And of course, many a child was placed underneath the floorboards, and he still carried on collecting the money. But they say he died of insanity, but he's haunted this very, very day. Yep. But in Bedden, this very day, is a listed building called Bedden Hall. Bedden Hall. You'll find that in the internet. It's a gorgeous building.
It's beautiful, isn't it? Yeah. You can get married there, I believe.
You can indeed. Yeah. But there's a gorgeous, gorgeous ghost story relating to it, if I can just mention this, please.
Please, yes.
We'll go back to the 1920s when Bedden Hall was literally in danger of collapsing.
Yes.
Local builders gathered like a flock of vultures to take away all the timber, all the stone. But on the 11th hour, the Bedden Hall Preservation Society were formed, and these consisted mainly of entrepreneurs and wealthy historians, and they produced enough money to save the building. They wouldn't let any Tom, Dick and Harry preserve the building, so they brought in an expert, a gentleman, wait for his name, called Mr. Michael Palin, no relation to our Monty Python star whatsoever. Palin was a very good restorer of medieval buildings. He had worked on Bodelwyddan Castle in North Wales and Levant Hall in Cumbria. He had worked in Bram Hall in Cheshire. He knew his stuff. He arrived with his 4 apprentices on a beautiful June day, 1923, and he gave each apprentice a different part of the hall to work on. He then chose the main hall itself, the main entrance, and got a ladder and climbed up the ladder and hammered away at some old and eroded stone to put new stone in. He pushed a huge block of stone off, and as it fell towards the earth, he was horrified to see a little boy standing there with curly black hair. He shouted, "Look out!" But the lad just stood there. The stone came down, grazed the little boy's nose, and landed right in front of his feet. Palin came down the ladder at great speed to tell this lad off. He could have been killed, could have been crushed. But the little boy shouted and reversed the situation. "You shouldn't be here. Mr. Pym's don't like it. You shouldn't be here. Mr. Pym's don't like it." "Well, I've got a right to be here, lad. You stand back. You could have been injured. You stand back." Palin turned round and climbed up the ladder. When he got to the top of the ladder, the little boy had just vanished. He thought, that's strange. He must be a quick runner. For the next 5 months, they worked really hard, bringing in new timber, new flooring, new tiling, and Bedden Hall was looking very much like its former self. They arrived on a bitterly cold December day in 1923, and all of a sudden the blue sky above York disappeared and was replaced by huge clouds of snow, and heavy, heavy snow came down into the city. The snow was so heavy that Michael told his 4 apprentices, "I'm sorry, lads, there's no way we'll get back home tonight. We'll have to spend the night here." The 4 boys complained bitterly, but there was enough firewood inside the hall to get the fire going, and by 4:30 in the afternoon, it was totally dark. It was just 3 days before Christmas, actually. In those days, no radios, no television, no Nintendos, no mobile phones, no laptops, so the only form of entertainment would be a good night's sleep, really. The 4 lads got their sleeping bags, and they rolled them out in front of the roaring fire, and they fell into a deep sleep. Michael got his sleeping bag and rolled it out, sat on top of it, and being an ardent Christian, had a few words with the good Lord upstairs. He then glanced to the right and saw a golden glowing light emanating from one of the hall's doors. Out of the golden glowing light appeared a very, very beautiful young lady in Tudor dress, and she very elegantly made her way past Palin and knelt in front of the roaring fire. Palin's heart hammered in his chest. His mouth went dry, and he glanced at her. She was a very beautiful young lady. She clasped her hands together in prayer and uttered the words, "Hope my husband survives the war." And then she disappeared, but left a very, very sweet, sweet scent in the air. Palin nervously glanced to his right and looked at the door entrance again, and saw another golden glowing light emanate from the door. And out of that golden glowing light appeared a 1642 Cavalier officer with bandoliers across his chest, goatee beard, feathers in his cap, sword by his side, riding boots, a typical Cavalier Civil War officer. He made his way to the fireplace, put his hand on top of the fireplace, and uttered the words, "Hope I survive the war." He too disappeared. By now, Palin, from his vantage point, is in a traumatic state. He gingerly, nervously glances to the door for the 3rd time and sees a much smaller light. And out of that golden glowing light stepped the little boy with the curly black hair that had nearly been hit by the stone in June of that year. The little boy ran past Palin and straight through the sleeping apprentices. As you can imagine, Palin did not sleep very well that night. But when he got back home to his wife and daughters, he never told them. And when the 4 lads woke up, he never told them either. He never told anyone. However, in 1943, as a very elderly gentleman, he was walking past Bedden Hall, as he had done on many occasions, and saw parked outside a military vehicle belonging to the RAF. He thought, Royal Air Force, what are they doing here? He walked towards the hall, he opened the door, and as he opened the door, he saw 2 Royal Air Force personnel standing by that very fireplace. One was a female in RAF uniform, one was a male in RAF uniform. As the door clicked, they turned round, and Palin made eye contact with the young lady in the RAF uniform. He just stood and stared at her. Quite naturally, she felt very embarrassed. "May I help you, please?" she said. Her companion, the officer, then intervened. "Can we help you, please?" Palin recognised the young girl in the RAF uniform to be the same beautiful young lady he had seen walk out of those golden glowing lights in 1923 in the Tudor dress, and he told her She burst into tears. Mr. Palin, I don't disbelieve a word you said, but I'm from the city of Leicester. I've never been to York in my life before, but as we drove past in the staff car, I shouted, stop, stop, stop. I know this place. I've been here before, Mr. Palin.
Wow.
And you have just answered my anxieties.
Wow, what a brilliant story.
It's a gorgeous story. I was talking to Tony Mercer quite recently, and he told me he actually met the lady in the RAF uniform. She's now in her early 90s, but she opened a handbag and she showed me a photo. She showed him a photograph of her in RAF uniform, and in fact told him the story, which married him beautifully with Palin's story as well. It's a gripping tale, Penny, a gripping tale.
Isn't it? I mean, one of the child that he saw was probably one of they reckon that Pym hid at least 13.
Oh, I'm sure.
At least 13 children, because over the 8 years that he ran the school, they reckon he hid at least 13 children's bodies. But the interesting thing with him, and I think this is poetic justice with George Pym, although, to be fair, he didn't actually kill these children. It's not that he was a serial killer, but he didn't. He worked them to the bone. He rented them out to do chimney sweeps and kept the money. And he didn't exactly worry about disease or nutrition for them. But supposedly, even while he was still the Beadle, he started saying he could hear noises, sort of wailing and tapping and scratching, and he became an alcoholic for other reason. And he ended up being, shall we say, yeah, you're right, he ended up being taken to a lunatic asylum because he said he could hear these children's wails and everything else. And it was after that they closed the place down because the church realised how abysmal it was. But I think that's poetic justice, that all these dead children, that he had a hand in their deaths because he should have been caring for them. He had a duty of care. They haunted him to his death, which I think is good for them.
Very
That's
much so.
I would say. But yes,
I've
if you ever
when I do the tours there, Penny, when you go there, you do feel an atmosphere. I mean, I'm not a psychic, I'm not a medium, I'm not a clairvoyant, but you do get an atmosphere from Bedden. You really, really do. It's quite uncanny, really.
Yeah. No, I think next time I go, I will be going with my psychic hat on to see if I can sense anything, because they do say people have heard children laughing and sort of and crying and all the things that children do late at night when there wouldn't be any children running up and down the alleys. So it's an interesting one. But that story about the fireplace and the RAF lady, and that's a beautiful story.
Intriguing.
That's a beautiful story,
isn't it?
Well, that's our hour up, Simon.
Oh, what a shame, Penny, because we could have continued, my dear, couldn't we?
I think we might have to do York Part 2 next year.
We'll have to.
We'll have to do, yeah.
There are some great stories in there.
Maybe after I've done my holiday, and then we can chat about some of the other places there, because it is an amazing city, and even some of the outlying areas of York have got an awful lot of stories to tell. We didn't even talk about the Golden Fleece pub, which is one that's got a lot of...
Golden Fleece, we've got the Old Star, haven't we?
Yeah.
We've got the York Castle, we've got Clifford's Tower.
We've got all of them.
There's still a bit more to go, really.
I think we've got a York Part 2 next year, if that's all right with you, sir.
My dear. Love to do that.
Well, thanks again for being my wonderful guest on tonight's show, Simon. As always, it's been an absolute joy to listen to you. I call your stories adult Jackanory because I do have to suddenly remember I'm supposed to interject at certain points when I'm listening to you tell them. But I hope you've all enjoyed listening to our, I suppose, Christmas special on York with Mr. Simon Entwistle. If you do want to go on one of Simon's tours, Top Hat Tours, is that the company name, if I remember right?
That's quite correct. Yeah, www.tophattours.co.uk. And do drop
Simon a line. He does some brilliant tours about Pendle to do the witches, and you can cross the Pennines and go and talk to him about York and all those kind of wonderful things. So thanks again for being my brilliant guest.
My pleasure, Penny. Thank you, dear.
It's been a pleasure as always. Thank you, everyone, for listening to Haunted Histories on Parasearch Radio. As I said, we will be back on the 3rd of January, but fret not. If you miss the sound of my voice, you can always go and listen to some of our previous shows that are stored on Spreaker and on YouTube. And don't forget the other Parasearch shows on every night of the week. But all that leaves me to say is thank you for listening, have a good evening, and don't worry too much about things that go bump in the night.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to join us for more shows throughout the week. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and the World Wide Web to keep up to date with all the shows right here on Parasearch Radio.